Today we're joined for our webinar on our launching of our scorecard with Acheson, the Director of WILPF's Disarmament Program Reaching Critical Will, Rasha Jarhum, a Yemeni social policy researcher and women's rights advocate with Yemeni Women's Pact for Peace, Marina Kumskova, the Associate with Women's Peacewomen, Women, Peace and Security Program, and myself, Abigail Ruane, the WILPF Peacewomen Program Director. Before we start our discussion, please note a couple of logistical points. One moment. First, everyone will be muted, as you can see, until the question and answer discussion, and also have your videos off so we cannot see you. You can see these icons on your desktop on the panel, on the control panel. During the question and answer session, there will be an opportunity for you to raise your hand by clicking the hand on the left side of the control panel, and you can also chat your questions in the box at the bottom. If you're having trouble with accessing the webinar, please do exit and return if you have difficulty, and we hope you'll be able to join us again soon. A couple of other points, please note that this webinar will be recorded and made available so that those who are not able to join now will be able to join later. And finally, feel free to follow us along with us on social media at Peacewomen and UNSCR 1325 hashtag. Thank you. So with that, let's begin. Thank you again for joining us at this event. Again, the title is Measuring State Commitments to Women, Peace and Security, the launch of WILPF's Women, Peace and Security Scorecard. My name is Abigail Ruane, and I'm WILPF's Program Director for the Women, Peace and Security Program. First, a couple of words about WILPF. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is the longest-standing women's peace organization, and this image is taken at our 100th anniversary last year in The Hague, where we mobilized 1,000 activists from 80 countries around women's power to stop war. WILPF works for peace and freedom through demilitarization, disarmament, and women's full and equal rights. We have offices in New York and Geneva, and sections with women activists in over 33 countries worldwide. We tackle the root causes of violence and conflict with our integrated approach that promotes women's human security over militarized state security. And we amplify the voices of grassroots women peacemakers and leverage international commitments on disarmament, women's human rights, and women, peace, and security to connect local to global and global to local action for transformative change. So, where are we today on women, peace, and security issues? In 2015, there was a high-level review of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. And 1325 was a pioneer commitment which committed to strengthening women's participation, protection, and rights in conflict prevention through post-conflict reconstruction processes. Last year's global study provided the evidence base for action. We know that women's rights are human rights, and we now know that gender equality is the #1 predictor of peace, and that feminist movements are the #1 predictor of reducing violence against women in policy. The time is now to change our priorities and invest in women's human rights and conflict prevention for peace. Last year's debate on women, peace, and security showed that there's an upswelling of support for the normative WPS agenda. There were a record number of debate speakers in the history of the Security Council. There have never been this many speakers on any debate, not just women, peace, and security issues. There was a record number of co-sponsors for this resolution, 2242, that was adopted. And there was also a record number of civil society speakers who last year joined from Iraq, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Libya. As the global study lead author, Radhika Kumaraswamy, noted, one of the key takeaways from the global study last year was the important gap on conflict prevention and demilitarization. As she stated, no to militarization, yes to prevention, that is what the women claim. 1 year after the global study and 16 years after UN Security Council Resolution 1325, we have yet to realize our women, peace, and security commitments. Next week, there will be a debate on Tuesday, October 25th, under the Russian presidency, which will focus on the global, following up to the global review and review of the 2015 commitments that were made. However, there are still key gaps in action that continue, especially on conflict prevention and women, peace, and security financing. What is the role of the Security Council on conflict prevention? It's critical to think carefully about this because Security Council members are responsible both as Security Council members and also as member states in general. The gaps on the agenda on conflict prevention are particularly problematic for Security Council Permanent 5 members who have a particular role on the WPS agenda. As the UN Charter Article 26 states, Security Council's responsibility is to promote peace and security with the least diversion for armaments and to establish a system for regulating armaments. However, as of last year, there's still a $1.6 trillion arms trade, and there's an annual military expenditures have increased by 60% between 2000 and 2015. Meanwhile, this is 13 times higher than the OECD aid that has been given out, and the cost of violence worldwide has been estimated at 14.3 trillion, or 13% of GDP. All of this flies in the face of both the UN Charter and other commitments, including the Beijing Declaration and Program for Action, CEDAW General Recommendation 30, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which has all 4 pillars which are relevant: participation, conflict prevention, protection, and relief and recovery, as well as effective implementation through financing and accountability. So given this context, I'd like to now pass off to my colleague, Acheson, who's the director of the Reaching Critical Will program, to ask her if she can speak a little bit to what is the connection between violence and militarism, and how do militarized investments reduce women's social and economic rights and impact cycles of violence. I'm going to pass off to Ray one moment.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And thanks very much to Peacewomen for organizing this. So I just had a few comments on this question that Abigail has just asked around the relationship between militarism and violence and women's rights and gender-based violence. So the way that we see many examples in the world today leading to violence through increased militarism, both in terms of conflict and outside of armed conflict or war. What we see is access to weapons within conflicts, leading to increased levels of violence, but we also see that there's a lot of profits that are being derived from flooding conflict zones or regions of conflict with weapons, and also perpetuating the concept of violence as the solution to all problems. And it becomes sort of the easiest way to deal with tensions, so that situations of conflict that are not violent at the moment will often escalate to violence because of the easy accessibility of weapons and the willingness of other heavily armed states being willing to contribute weapons and other resources to armed conflict. This has a number of impacts on women, peace, and security issues in particular. Within conflict, of course, we see all the time these cycles of violence where access to resources is limited, and this can often have a specific impact on women in relation to men and others in the community. We also see often exacerbation of social violence, further discrimination against women, especially when men are often the most direct victims of the armed conflict, and women are left to pick up the pieces and face different social structural barriers to their participation within the community. We also see further sexual violence within armed conflict situations, especially when there is increased displacement or refugees. We've seen, for example, many of the conflicts in the Middle East ongoing now, a lot of sexual violence against the women that are fleeing these conflicts. There's also violence that is specifically targeted against women or against others on the basis of their sex or their sexuality or gender identity. And in the context of women, the gender-based violence that we're seeing is quite diverse, both inside and outside of armed conflict. So we have many examples, of course, of small arms guns being used to facilitate rape through intimidation and coercion. But we also see heavy conventional weaponry being used to commit acts of gender-based violence and sexual violence as well. And we've seen, for example, in Syria, women being stripped naked and forced to escort tanks through contested areas and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that weapons themselves facilitate gender-based violence. In terms of the P5 and their contributions to these conflicts and militarism and violence, I just wanted to give a few quick examples of ongoing problems. We have, for example, the UK, the US, and France all selling many weapons to Saudi Arabia. They're making billions of dollars off of this conflict. The United States, over the last 10 years, has sold $115 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The United Kingdom has actually just become the world's second largest arms dealer because of their contributions to Saudi Arabia. And of course, Saudi Arabia is currently leading an air bombardment campaign in Yemen, which is causing mass destruction there to civilian infrastructure, leading to deaths of many civilians, leading to displacement. Water supplies are being destroyed, healthcare facilities are being destroyed. It's a very grim situation. We also have, at the same time, bombing going on in Syria, of course, which Russia is actively contributing to, together with the Syrian government. And then we have the US and the UK and others also bombing in different parts of Syria, targeting non-state actors. In terms of China's contributions, if we look at the situation in South Sudan, where there's been mass rapes, both of civilians and aid workers, China has been selling, over the last few years, millions of dollars worth of arms and ammunitions feeding into that conflict. So those are just a few things that I think are useful for the scorecard and those analyzing women, peace, and security issues in the context of militarism and violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, for that very helpful overview. And Ray has recently launched some reports with Reaching Critical Will on this, so we very much encourage you to check out their website on that. Next, I'd like to turn to Rasha Jarhum, who's a social policy researcher and women's rights advocate in Yemen with the Yemen Women Pact for Peace. So Rasha, could you say a little bit about what is the impact of militarism and arms on violence, including sexual and gender-based violence and violence against women in local communities in Yemen? What are women doing to stop some of the militarism and violence, and what can the international community do in support? We're now going to switch over to Rasha's screen.
Hello. Hello.
1 moment.
I hope you can hear me. Yes. I'm glad to be here. Going about the impact Yemeni women's start sharing with you. I thought I would start with a positive note. This is a picture of a campaign, a woman-led campaign. Her name is Nisma. She's the model and the designer of the campaign, and she is campaigning for the disarmament, targeting the youth and the children of Yemen to disarm. And I thought, in order to talk about arms trade in Yemen and the impact of this on women's rights, I have to give you a picture about Yemen before this war. And Yemen is a country that always witnessed sporadic conflict throughout its history in the last 2 decades at least, and even before. And so before this war, we were one of the highest countries that had privately owned weapons per 100 people. We had around 8 million to 11.5 million privately. 61% of households had at least 1 to 2 guns. This is statistics from 2008. And 84% of homicide cases were guns related. Now with the war, this magnified, and we have the government and we have the Houthis and Saleh militia. And the arms transfer and supply continues to be the highest for Saudi. And this is the information that I obtained from the and as you can see that 1983 have either agreed or delivered arms transfers to Saudi Arabia during this is information since August 2016. 3 of these countries are UNSC members, which is the UK, USA, and France, and Ray has already mentioned that. Just I wanted to highlight that France is actually the highest, I mean, in terms of supplying weapons. This was according to militia continue to have weapons through homemade munitions and battlefield seizures of unsecured stockpiles and diversions from the Yemeni national forces and illicit arms transfers. Page and just browsing different weapons, and you can just easily obtain weapons. The humanitarian impact is devastating. We had already a humanitarian protracted crisis that was, even before this war, was characterized to be catastrophic. And now with this war, it has amplified. We have many 32,000 were injured. Now 82% of the population are in dire humanitarian need. We have 7 million people who are, more than 7 million people who are on the verge. In cases of half a million women cannot deliver their babies safely. Devastating. Before the war, I wanted to share with you what was the violence against women before the war. And it was also classified sometimes as the worst country for a woman to live in. There are no laws specifically to protect women in the penal code, but with very vague the types of violence that existed before the war is child marriages, polygamy, female genital mutilation, denial of inheritance, restrictions to mobile rural women. With the war, all of this has magnified. OCHA has estimated that GBV, gender-based violence, there is a project that of around more than 1,000. 88% of the victims were female, 17% of them were cases of children below 18. The types of GBV cases ranged between rape, sexual assault, physical and assault and denial of resources, and the highest was physical and psychological and emotional abuse and denial of resources. The perpetrators that can be army men, and 4% were militia groups. This is according to these documented cases. Another local NGO have also confirmed these results, but most of the type of violence is of resources, and either forced or brainwashed to support even the efforts to fight for war. Types of violence against women that is reported during this war is the targeting of women, cluster bombs, there was also reporting of one case of stoning a woman in Hadramaut by Qaeda for adultery. There is also increased restrictions of mobility of women politicians, especially. For example, there is imposed. There is arbitrary detention for women, including. This is a picture of one of the religious minority women who was detained because she attended a workshop about religious dialogue, and the whole group was detained and later released. Assaults also on female students, journalists, human rights defenders, relief workers, female relief workers, and women protesters. All of these types of violence has increased because of this war. There is also a very trend that we witnessed in this war, which is an increase in militarization of women. And women are recruited by all warring parties, militia groups and armed groups. This is two pictures from two locations, Sana'a and Ta'az. And the women, so far we didn't validate the cases that they are fighting in front lines, but they are involved in armed action, places, dispersing protests violently, and are not spared. This is a parade that was done in Ta'az and another parade that was done in Sana'a to display the power of women, and are encouraged to hold a weapon and display it as something to be proud of. What makes it even more devastating is that, for example, the humanitarian response plan of the UN and reintegration. We have a third of the fighters are child combatants, and with suspension of such an intervention makes it really devastating, because there is no to help them. The war has, even before the war, it was not as we hoped for, and there was a huge gender parity between boys and girls in education. Even more, security is one of the reasons that children cannot go to school. 30% of the education facilities are physically damaged, and the others are not functional, either because they are damaged or because they are occupied as shelter for IDPs. Similarly, the services to health. Even before the war, we had around 6 women dying every day due to pregnancy complications. With the war, it became even more exaggerated. We have now half of access a proper health care. 28% of the health facilities have been damaged, and we have more than 14 million people who are in need of healthcare services. Similarly, social protection have been impacted. For example, we have the Social Welfare Fund. This is one of the biggest targets, including 45% women. They have around 1.5 million beneficiaries in Yemen, and they get usually allowance of $17 per month for every individual. And this program has been suspended since 2015 in January. And their offices have been damaged, so we have a group of vulnerable people who do not receive any support. Moreover, now the civil servants' salaries also are being interrupted or deducted or not dispersed at all. So I'm coming to the end of my presentations, and it go to all the parties, especially those who are committing to ATT. Humanitarian response plan must be funded, especially the GBV cluster. Unfortunately, the humanitarian response plan is very underfunded, and nothing goes to the gender-based violence cluster. Programs of disarmament, reintegration, and demobilization of combatants are required, especially children combatants. We need support to the documentation and monitoring of GBV cases in Yemen, and building the capacity of the local NGOs to do their own documentation shelters. We don't have any system to deal with GBV cases. And finally, we need more women. We need women inclusion in peace negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasha, for sharing that really valuable insight about the connection between what happens in the Security Council and how it really impacts women on the ground. Within this context, we'd like to now move over to my colleague, Marina Kumskova, who is the WILPF Peacewomen Program Associate, and just ask you, as one of the two lead researchers on the Security Council Scorecard, can you tell us a little bit about this project? What is the scorecard? Why was it created? And can you just walk us through it so we can understand what it covers and how activists can use it to strengthen accountability on peace, disarmament, and gender justice?
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Ray and Rasha, for your really interesting and quite disturbing presentation. So I would like to start with reiterating the point that has been made previously in this presentation, is that the permanent members of the Security Council do have a unique responsibility to strengthen the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Of course, it cannot happen in one moment, but we do encourage member states to progressively contribute towards the implementation and strengthening of the WPS agenda. And with this understanding, we have developed the Women, Peace and Security Scorecard project that you can see, I hope, now on your screens, and that can also be accessible on peacewomen.org/scorecards. By using a specific criteria developed on the basis of international women, peace and security standards, we have developed a set of international and national indicators that help us to identify the progress that has been made by the members of the permanent members of the Security Council towards the strengthening of WPS agenda. So on your screen, you can see the table now that demonstrates all the categories that we have used to analyze the performance of countries, and also we can see the list of countries. As it's understandable from these percentages, the key gaps that remain towards the strengthening of the Women, Peace and Security agenda are Security Council actions, Women, Peace and Security financing, and prevention. That's pretty much what has been discussed previously. As you can see, all of the permanent members of the Security Council did receive the lowest grades for that. And I'm going to explain the methodology a little bit later, so you will be able to understand that it was based on an actual performance. We can also see, if you click on by year analysis, you will be able to see the progress that has been made by each of the permanent members of the Security Councils throughout the period between 2010 and 2015. So as you can see, the progress remains very minimal and very inconsistent. In some cases, if we look at the particular example of France, we can see that between 2010 and 2012, we see a small increase in the performance. But however, if we compare 2010 to 2015, we can see that the performance has actually decreased as opposed to increased, as we were hoping for. And the same trend basically applies for Russia. But that's not only outcome that can be taken away from this project, and I would like to discuss more on our findings during the Q&A session. If you scroll down on the front page of the Security Council, you will be able to see the case studies of 5 permanent members. And if you click on one of them, I will just choose the first one. We will be able to see a particular case study of a performance of a particular state throughout the period of 2010 and 2015 on all indicators. And we also tried to make a good job visualizing that. So if I click the really first category, which is Security Council actions, you will be able to visually see the progress that has been made by a particular state in their performance at the Security Council. So if I take the really first example that is demonstrated by the purple line, it covers the number of statements in which a particular state has covered women, peace, and security sensitive issues. And positively enough, the progress, as you can see, has been made over time. However, if we look at the highest point that has been achieved by the state in 2015, we can see that the percentage is only 41.2%, which means that 60% of the statement that has been made by this particular state at the Security Council remain gender blind, which is, as we know, not really positive trend. And obviously, if you click on more indicators, you will be able to assess the performance in all other indicators, national, international, and national as well. For those of you who are interested in seeing more in details, where are we taking information from, and what kind of criteria we are using to demonstrate our findings, can click on one of the years to see in-depth study of the performance of the state within a particular year. So if we click on the year 2010, for example, we will be able to see the percentages that have been received by a state in this particular year. And then if we click on really first category, we will be able to see the number of indicators that have been included to be able to analyze performance of this particular state in, for example, Security Council actions. And if we click on one of the indicators, we'll be able to see our justifications from where 20% do come from. So we have a criteria. For, in this particular case, we assume that state has to internalize women, peace, and security sensitive issues throughout all the discussions at the Security Council. And if it has not been done, then obviously the state has to score lower. And as analysis box demonstrates why a particular state received a particular grade. So in this example, China has discussed gender-sensitive issues in only 3 statements out of 15 open debates in this given year. Therefore, doing mathematical calculations, we get 20%. The comment box and the resources are provided for your information, so you will be able to strengthen your understanding and probably hopefully build upon our project and make WPS advocacy even stronger. So that was my short overview of the WPS Scorecard project, and we will be happy to discuss more questions during the Q&A. And if you go to the peacewomen.org/scorecards, you will be able to see more and more and more. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina, for walking us through the scorecard, and also to all of our participants. Ray, unfortunately, has had to leave early for us right now, but to Rasha as well. We'd like to now turn it over to a Q&A session with the audience where we can give you the opportunity to ask our questions of the panelists. If you would like to ask a question, please do raise your hand. You can see the hand icon on the control panel on the left-hand side, or put a comment in the comment box and we will call on you. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to start off with? Great, thank you. So I see a couple of hands that are being raised now and that are going down. Let's see. I'm going to start with Nista Agarwal. Nista, I'm going to put you on mute, and then we'll go on to Emily Bove after that. Nista, what is your...
My question relates to the WPS agenda and how we can measure its effectivity in countries that are experiencing internal conflict. It becomes a pretty murky situation to even think of how far the WPS agenda might land on the ground and have some sort of an impact, particularly within Southeast Asian states where they are experiencing quite a lot of internal conflict. Would you be able to comment on that at all?
Thank you, Nista. I'm just going to take a couple of questions and then we can respond as a group, okay?
Sure.
Emily, I'm going to add your question next. Emily Bove. I'm unmuting you now. Emily, what was your question?
Hear me? You're great. Okay. Hi. We actually had a question and maybe a comment. A question from Noelle that's with me here was, how is the women's major group going to use these scorecards, and if there have been discussions on how we can, use them for our advocacy. And then the comment is in terms of development and organizations working in the development field, how can we try and merge data that is presented here in these scorecards with more precise, deeper dive into the amounts that these countries, and I'm looking at the US right now, are giving to programs to try and combat violence against women, because we feel it's really important to try, especially in the wake of the new administration, to link these issues and to not keep them siloed. So I was wondering if you had thought about how you could maybe go a step further in making that comparison, or if it's something that you hope people will do but you won't be focusing on.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, so why don't we start with these two, and then we'll move on to the next two. The first one was, how can women, peace, and security be measured in terms of its effectiveness in conflict? I'm happy to say a couple of words to that, but Rasha, is that something that you'd be interested in saying a little bit too?
Yes, hi.
Go ahead, Rasha.
What we're doing in Yemen. Okay, thank you. Because we are in conflict, and this was actually a chapter. There is no CEDAW arranged for the country. What we did is we combined the CEDAW recommendation number 30 with the 1325, and we developed themes that can be that we can report on, and those themes. So we have, I think, around conflict and prevent gender-based violence, trafficking, participation, and women armed recruitment, access to services, funding gap, and so this is what we did from Yemen.
Thank you, Rasha. That's very helpful. Nista, just to add to that a little bit, I think the question about how can WPS be effectively measured in conflict is a very good one that really highlights the importance of prevention as a pillar of the WPS agenda. Over the last 16 years on women, peace, and security issues, as I'm sure you've seen, we have seen sort of a shrinking of the agenda, which was originally supposed to focus on all four pillars: participation, prevention, relief and recovery, and protection, towards an increasing focus on just protection around issues of sexual violence and conflict. And as you'll know from speaking to any woman who's in a conflict zone, dealing with women's rights and women's participation issues while there are being bombs that are being dropped on the ground is going to be inherently problematic. So strengthening women's participation, protection, and rights in conflict settings does require that we look at the prevention not only of sexual and gender-based violence individually, but also the prevention of conflict in general. So in terms of bringing attention to how to measure the effectiveness in conflict, I think what Rasha was speaking to are some suggestions of how to do so. we do need to work with grassroots activists who are on the ground, and leverage international commitments such as CEDAW General Recommendation 30, which basically translated the WPS agenda into human rights frameworks and now provides a monitoring mechanism for us that we can feed into the shadow reports and the recommendations around that in key conflict situations. But I think it also needs to, this sort of bridges to the next question. I think we also need to look at the data as it connects to work done across the UN system so that it's not sort of siloed and sidelined and therefore ignored in broader efforts. So on that, the second question, Emily's question with Noel, on how can the Women's Major Group use this kind of scorecard data and merge it with data, country data on addressing violence against women. I think this is also a very good question. My reaction would be that I think one of the big opportunities for using this would come up around next year's high-level political forum. So the Women's Major Group is a coalition that works primarily around the Sustainable Development Goals, which WILPF is a part of, and which we worked actively to promote standalone goals on gender equality and peaceful and stable societies, goals 5 and 16. And now that the SDGs have been launched last year, they will be having a high-level political forum which provides an accountability mechanism on a yearly basis where states can provide voluntary reviews of their action on the SDGs. And I think as part of that review process, there will, civil society, including the Women's Major Group, will probably be contributing to shadow reports and other monitoring frameworks, including potentially, databases and otherwise. And I think drawing on this kind of data so that when we are evaluating states' action on Goal 16, we really use a women, peace, and security lens and a women's human rights lens will be really critical to ensuring that the SDGs are translated through a women's human rights perspective. Does that, so I'm going to pass on to the next set of questions here. One moment. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to Marie-Claire, who has her hand up. And Marie-Claire, you should be able to be on audio. Do you have your question? Would you be able to type it in, because we can't hear you, Marie-Claire? Okay, so while we're waiting for Marie-Claire, I'm going to move on to Nana Pratt. Nana, would you be able to say your question? Go ahead, Nana.
Thank you very much. And my question is around the question of financing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, especially in developing countries where there is limited funds for looking into some of these women's concerns and issues.
Thank you, Nana. On the financing question, that is a fantastic point. As we noted in the presentation, this financing is a critical gap. We really, as WILPF, we reject the idea that there is no money for gender equality or for peace and security, because we do have the money and we spend it badly. I think some of the statistics that we mentioned earlier show that that's the case, and we've recently launched a Women, Peace and Security Financing Toolkit to move the money from war to peace, and you can get that on our website. I think really at this point, we're facing challenges at a number of levels. First of all, there is limited spending at the policy level on gender equality through gender budgeting. We recently, last year, at the Global Study found that only 2% of aid to peace and security countries directly target gender equality. That's terrible. We also now know that this is an issue that is the same across the world. States still inconsistently integrate gender budgets across the board. They still have something like 10 or 11 national action plans that are fully financed on women, peace, and security. And in general, there is an inadequate and very low-level financing of women, peace, and security issues in general. So one of the things that can be done in this regard is to push for gender financing of women, peace, and security at every level. So if you check out our women, peace, and security financing toolkit, that provides some preliminary ideas of what states can do. For example, they can invest in gender-responsive budgeting on social and economic kinds of contexts. They can reduce their military spending, such as Uruguay has recently done in the wake of their dictatorship, so as to be able to follow up on commitments on the Beijing platform to reallocate to gender equitable social development. They can finance national action plans, and they can invest in civil society inclusive UN funds. This is just the beginning of what can be done, but more is clearly needed. I'm going to move on now to the next question.
Peace building fund. We're not the first. So it puts me on up. And I will be the look Christy. No, not yet.
Sorry, one second. Actually, the Peace Building Fund is a good thing to point out. The Peace Building Fund has recently come up with a Women, Peace, and Security initiative that for the first time was open to civil society. And they will, for the first time this year, are investing in civil society, which is something that we need to push. So the Global Acceleration Instrument is another fund that's recently come out, which shows a good practice example of how this can be done. In that case, they have civil society on the board and also commit to funding at least 50% of the fund goes to civil society action, and that's something that the UN should do across the board for funds everywhere. So I'm going to go on now to the next question, which I have Amelia Formas. Amelia, can you share your question?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for the session and the work you do. I have the perception that everyone who chooses women, peace, and security as a subject for advocacy and as a profession is enough crazy to believe that it's possible to change the world. So my question is, do you think that is there a real chance to implement successfully the Women, Peace and Security agenda while weapon providers continue feeding armed conflict?
Thank you very much for that. One moment while I find, 1 second.
Thanks.
Okay, so. Okay, I'm going to just take 2 more questions, and then I'm going to pass it around to all of the panelists who can respond as a group. Acacia, what is your question, Acacia?
Hi, good very early morning to everyone from Australia. Thank you for today, that was great. My question is kind of spurred by recently reading the Global Slavery Index, just released by Walk Free, and wondering how Women, Peace and Security addresses the issues surrounding how conflict drives vulnerable people into slave-based work that feeds in global supply chains and the things that we buy in our everyday lives. And how can Women, Peace and Security look at addressing that within conflict?
Thank you, Acacia. I'm going to take 1 more, and then I'm going to do a round with the panelists. Marie-Claire, you're able to speak. Marie-Claire? Marie-Claire, unfortunately, we're still having a hard time hearing from you. We'll look for your question in the comments. So then I'll just take Marama's instead. Marama, can you share your question?
Yes, thank you. Kia ora from New Zealand. and thank you for this very sobering presentation. How can we accelerate and increase the support for women in crisis countries, but also others around the world? What is urgently needed? And the answer on finance certainly seems to be highlighted, but there seems to be other things that we can do collectively, individually, to raise awareness about this and also to start to affect change in this area. Thank you. Kia ora.
Thank you, Manara. Okay, I'm going to do a round of panelists. So, Rasha, would you like to speak to any of these questions, either on the possibility of implementing WPS within the context of bombing, on the Global Slavery Index and supply chains as connected to WPS, or on strengthening support for critical action? Rasha, feel free to respond to as you prefer.
All right. Coming from a country devastated by war, I think we have no option but to work harder to implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. It has been challenging. I've been privileged to be selected to support the peace talks in their third. And unfortunately, there was no commitment, even voices, not at the level that we aspire. Intervention was only a visit on the sideline of the talks, and currently there isn't an official talks where both parties are there. But the UN continue their negotiation with both. There is not to the level that we aspire to as Yemeni women. In Yemen as well, is that the countries that are sponsoring the peace or claiming to be sponsoring the peace negotiations are the countries who are also supplying weapons. So this kind of hypocrisy is just not acceptable anymore. So claim the responsibility to be complex party and then bring mediators and who are neutral and stop pretending to be peace sponsors. This is for Yemeni context. The other about supporting women and the agenda, I feel this is something that I saw increasingly. The Yemeni women, even who are apart from the devastating humanitarian catastrophic, all of Yemeni women, the Yemeni women who are handling the peacemaking and human rights, defending human rights, are increasingly subject to harassment, increasingly subject to criticism and attacks, and some programs where they can have protection and where they can amplify their voices and where they can also get, positive energy from other women in the world so that they can continue to advocate and push for this. This is my thoughts, and yeah, I give it back to you, Abby. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasha. So Marina, do you want to speak to any of these questions? Or Katie, we also are fortunate enough to have both of the researchers that contributed to this scorecard as part of this discussion. Katie Kruger is in the audience as well, so I just wanted to open it up. Either Marina or Katie, would either of you like to speak to any of these questions? Katie?
Can you hear me? Hello? Hi. Hi, thank you all so much. This is really a wonderful opportunity to listen to all the speakers and have everyone in the audience. I think that it's a great question to really think about the impact that this that the scorecard can have working with civil society actors at the local level who are also working to influence national level efforts as well within their countries. One of the really interesting things that the scorecard has done is it looks at the international actions of the member states as well as their national actions. And we have found that when you look at the financial priorities of the Security Council member states, the P5, we have found that they are contributing significantly to military expenditures, and we have been able to track those expenditures over time from 2010 until 2015, and we definitely can see the changes over time throughout the different countries. And I think having that information can definitely influence civil society actors as well as national people within the P5 working at this state and international level as well to hopefully influence a transition towards more peaceful economies and gender justice. And when you also look at the national actions, you can, we've developed the scorecard to really build upon the pillars of the WPS agenda, looking at prevention, participation, protection, and recovery support. So the information that we've been able to track over time can certainly help influence civil society efforts at the local level as well by providing them more information, by giving them resources that we've looked at to find helpful based on internationally recognized treaties and reports and other information. So I think that having this Security Council scorecard with all the information that it kind of brings together, I think that it definitely can be a valuable resource for civil society working to prevent militarization and also to support the national level prevention, participation, protection, and recovery support at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Marina, would you like to speak to any of this?
I just want to add, thank you, Katie, for your answer to this question. Is that were a lot of questions asking how we can actually use the scorecard project to support the work of women in crisis situation or to support development work. And actually, since the permanent members of the Security Council have such a, have used its veto rights in a very disproportionate way, and since the permanent members of the Security Council, as we know, are basically the leading actors on all the resolutions and all the international actions on WPS agenda, we actually invite everyone to use this tool as a huge bulk of information on what are the failures on Permanent 5. And we want to invite you to think about the fact that if permanent members of the Security Council do make these mistakes, obviously other countries are also not safe from not making them. Therefore, our findings did demonstrate that many states, many permanent members of the Security Council do spend their money on military, and they disregard completely the funding that goes to UN Women. They disregard completely any WPS initiative that are supporting the work of women in crisis situation, the work of women in development, the work of women in human rights areas. So if we will invite, using the arguments made at in the scorecard project, if we will invite member states to move their agenda from military expenditures, from receiving money from arms transfers into investing more in WPS projects, if we will invite them to invest more in protection, not only internationally but also nationally, that can be a way to use the scorecard as an advocacy tool, but we obviously cannot do it just on ourselves. So therefore we would like to invite development actors to contribute on how we can strengthen the argument of the scorecard project and how we can move that forward.
Thank you, Marina. Just to add to some of the excellent comments that have been made so far, I just want to point out that often, given the focus of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda on situations of conflict and violence, there tends to be a sense that implementation of the agenda only applies to conflict countries, one of the things that we wanted to do with this scorecard is really use it to remind developed countries, especially the permanent 5 members, that implementing the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is not something that happens just outside of their own countries, far away, but it's something that we have a huge responsibility to uphold in our own countries and in the work of the leaders of the Security Council. So, for example, some concrete things that can be done if you are a member of or a citizen of one of these countries, or if you can support one of the P5 in advocacy efforts, there's a few very concrete mechanisms that have been developed recently that you can push for. Last year, there was the development of an informal expert group based on UN Security Council Resolution 2242, which actions the recommendation by the global study to create a concrete space where Security Council members can have their country-level experts meet on a regular basis and provide practical action in those areas. So all Security Council members should be engaging with the informal expert group, they should be having their country-level experts participate, and they should be ensuring that the commitments that happen at the international level translate down at the mission level, including through active and meaningful engagement with civil society, through integration of gender, including through terms of reference and other in the mission mandates, and otherwise. They can also, at the council level, just have an increased awareness. So if you see the scorecard, you see that there's still an inconsistent and ad hoc recognition of women, peace, and security issues in country statements at the Security Council. Last year, the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, which WILPF is a part of, came out with a civil society roadmap that provides recommendations for Security Council members to just ask about key questions and take action on them along the way. Although the global study is very huge and sometimes, overwhelming in its size, the roadmap is very short, very concise, and all Security Council members should be able to look at it and check themselves as to whether or not they're asking these gendered questions in the Council. In addition, there needs to be concrete action taken in issues of peace and mediation situations. As anyone who has been following Syria knows, there is a huge challenge both towards just the level of devastation, conflict, and humanitarian issues of humanitarian concern in the country, but even in the situation where there was an active work towards peace processes, women were actively excluded. This was in large part because the Syrian special representative there's not an institutionalized way to ensure that there are women at the table, to ensure that women have their own space, and that there are gender mediators and gendered advisors integrated through those processes. In the Geneva II processes a couple of years back around Syria, there were actually 50 women who came together with their own peace process, their own peace plan for Syria 20 kilometers away from the main peace negotiations, and they were not included in the process. We cannot let that happen again. And finally, of course, there is a critical need for reducing the military expenditures instead of having them continue to increase, and redirecting those to gender equitable social development. And for that, we really need to reach out to civil society and finance experts who are not always in collaboration together across development side and security sides, and see how we can build on things like the SDGs and the humanitarian commitments to strengthen financing for women, peace, and security issues, so it's not just a small amount of money that we work with and are continuing to be losing out on. Okay, so that was hold on one second. Okay, so I am going to take the next couple of questions. I'm cognizant that some people may need to leave, but I'm going to try and take a couple more questions for people who are able to stay. Let's see, I'm going to take a couple of some of the questions that are texted. One is from Jenny Yang. She says, how do non-P5 countries such as Canada perform on the scorecard? Are there any specific ways to improve? In addition, according to a recent defense ministerial in London, one goal is to double the number of women in military and police units of UN peacekeeping operations by 2020. Is this a reasonable target? And I have one from Marie Claire who says, are there any ongoing or scheduled studies for more scorecards in other countries, particularly post-conflict countries where there's a UN peacekeeping mission? And Ray Sao says, how would you measure the impact of the scorecard over time to see if it's a useful tool to hold governments accountable to women, peace, and security? And then there's some technical questions. Emily Bove asks, we're wondering where the profit from arms transfer, 10,484,000, or whatever that long number is, comes from the USA. So those are the questions that I have in the comments, which are primarily around the scorecard research. So I'm going to ask Marina and Katie if they'd be interested in speaking to those questions.
Thank you, Abby. So in terms of Canada and other member states of the United Nations, we wish we would be able to include more countries in our research, and we are actually planning to do so. However, using the number of indicators that we use for our scorecard project, it's unfortunately not possible to track the progress made by non-permanent members of the Security Council, because one of the biggest category in our research was Security Council actions, in which we are trying to measure how the percentage of how often countries address women, peace, and security issues in the Security Council. And since not all member states of the United Nations are in the Security Council, and since not all of them can be at the Security Council for such a long period of time, we unfortunately are not being able to measure that. And as I have mentioned previously, we did concentrate on the permanent 5 of the Security Council, simply because there is so much power given to them, and we believe that it's really useful to highlight the key gaps and basically to be able to analyze the progress that they have been made throughout. Like, I guess it's a really short period of time between 2010 and 2015. However, we will work further and we will do more on this. And hopefully, the main key gaps that we have identified during our research can open the understanding for all other member states on what needs to be done towards the proper straightening of the WPS agenda. And responding to the question on how do we ensure that scorecard is a useful tool is basically by doing more advocacy. We cannot assume that the results that we have determined at this in the WPS scorecard project will be a useful tool unless they are used. Therefore, we are planning to do a set of policy briefs explaining the situation in each particular issue for each particular category. We will be addressing the issues related to the protection as much in depth as the issues related to the Security Council actions, hoping over time to change the understanding of member states of the Security Council that it's really important to address gender-sensitive issues throughout all discussions in the Security Council, including thematic topics, including peacekeeping mandates, and everything else what is being currently discussed at the Security Council.
Thanks, Marina. Katie, do you want to add anything to that? Let me just find you 1 second. Katie, is there anything you'd like to add?
Hi, I think that Marina did a great job answering the question. I will say that I think we may not have been able to look at the other, members of the UN at this point in time, but we do hope to do so at some point in the future. And we also believe that some of the same challenges that the countries we did look at in the P5, the same challenge or some of the same challenges that they have faced may be related to many other countries around the world. And so I think it is a valuable resource to take a look at, even if it is not specifically on the country that you're interested in looking at. Some of the same challenges may be present in other countries, and I think that those countries and people interested in those countries can be taken from the scorecard as well.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, so maybe also, yeah, so are there any other questions at this time? We are running out of our comments, or our question period. I think we have covered all of the questions in the ones that are submitted on text. The last question that I see is, unfortunately, I missed the first few minutes, by Eugenia. Will your research be published? And she's very interested within a Soviet context about the scorecards. And yes, for anybody who's joined late, so please do feel free to find our fully published scorecard, which is available on peacewomen.org. And I think there were some technical questions that may not have been addressed here. You can also feel free to follow up with me and Marina directly, Abigail at peacewomen.org or Marina at peacewomen.org. Are there any other questions before we finish up? If not, then I'm going to pass it around one last time for the panelists to have final thoughts. Okay, so I would just like to pass it back to Rasha. Would you like to say a few words in closing?
Thank you so much. This was a great webinar, and I think we need a network of solidarity between women to support each other. And the Women, Peace and Security Agenda have to be a priority and have to be integrated in all of action plans, whether it's countries that conflict or don't have conflict. This has to be a priority. I hope what I have talked peace and the role of countries in mediation of peace have to disengage from arms trade and commit more to the ATT. And that's all.
Thank you, Rasha. Marina, would you like to say anything as final thoughts?
Again, I just want to highlight the point that the strengthening of the WPS agenda is an ongoing process, and we do invite member states to actually contribute to this ongoing process and do not contribute to the decrease in the implementation of the WPS agenda. This tool is WPS Scorecard project is a very useful tool for academia, civil society, non-governmental organization, as well as for governments to make an argument about how important that is to strengthen the WPS agenda. We invite everyone to use this tool to support your work, to strengthen your arguments, but also we would like interested parties to build on our project and to move this WPS agenda and implementation of the WPS agenda further. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will be happy to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Marina. And on behalf of my colleague, Ray Acheson, who unfortunately has had to leave, I do want to again direct any of you who are interested to the WILPF's Reaching Critical Will website, where we have a variety of different reports, such as women's weapons and war, trading arms, bombing towns, and otherwise, where we examine in more detail the impact of the arms trade on gender-based violence and women. And I think on my final thoughts, I'd just like to share that, building on some of the comments about the connection between sort of economies of war versus economies of feminist peace, I think this is a really important concept to recognize, that the Women, Peace and Security agenda cannot be realized if we're not going to massively increase our efforts to prevent conflict and war in general. And preventing conflict is also critical and highly interconnected with gender equality and women's human rights. And if we look at moving forward, we need to move away from political economies of violence in war, where we currently overly value and invest in the military-industrial complex, and instead really recognize the consistently undervalued care economy and the impact of the war economy on peace and gender equality worldwide. I think it's very difficult to pay attention to some of these issues without being sort of sad, but I'd like to remind us that, you know, Rasha, who has joined us on this panel, has really just one example of the incredibly brilliant, passionate, brave, and courageous women human rights defenders worldwide who are really working for concrete change, and that change has paid off. Some of the work that we've seen recently has recognized that how women in places like Mexico have worked with their policymakers to integrate gender budgeting, and in a 10-year period change the style of the roads. In Uruguay, women parliamentarians have worked to, in the wake of the dictatorship, or reduce, in the wake of the coup, reduce the military spending overall, and actually reduce the scope of the military mandate and take positions of power which were previously under the military and put them under civilian control. And in the conditions of women in conflict situations, we see, you know, the examples of women in Syria who are active in both local peace processes on the ground and providing the groundwork for long-term peace when there is the opportunity to do so, even while they're being actively excluded at the international peace process level. So I think there is room for hope. What we've done with this scorecard is certainly not, it's certainly a caution, even if it is bringing forth some harsh truths. And we'd like to encourage all of you to work with us to share the information that you see here and call for the Permanent Five to really step up and realize their role as leaders on peace and security by strengthening action on the conflict prevention gap through demilitarization, disarmament, and women's human rights. So thank you again for joining us. Please do check out the scorecard on the website, peacewomen.org, and reach out to us with questions. Thank you.